Welcome back. And today we will start our discussion of chapter 10, which is on human development. You've probably heard people say that age is just a number. It's an awfully informative number. Imagine if I said I was going to introduce you to my friend Sam. And the only thing I tell you about Sam, I picked a gender androgynous name, is that Sam is 30 years old. Well, that comes up with a lot of expectations about what Sam can do and is probably doing and might be interested in. And you'd have very different expectations of Sam's interests, abilities, social roles, etc. if I said that Sam was 85 versus if I said that Sam was 2. Totally different expectations. Because though age is a number, it's correlated with an awful lot. Developmental psychologists study how human mind, how behavior changes over time. We mature throughout our lives. We age in one direction. Nobody's born old and then, regresses back into youth. We all develop, we all go through stages in a pretty similar way. All babies crawl before they can walk. We develop wrinkles and gray hair later on in life. And as we get older and older, there's more and more cognitive decline. That process of maturation is genetic. There's actually a condition called progeria, which you may have heard of, where that aging process for genetic reasons seems to set in very soon, like age 1. And so you have toddlers, you have 5-year-olds who look like old people. I mean, they have the bodies of children. They have gray hair and they have wrinkles. They still have the minds of children. And they live until their teens, typically. There's some famous YouTubers like Dahlia Rose who have progeria. And they typically die from the things that kill older adults, older normal adults, things like heart disease and stroke. And that's an example of how biological the process of maturation is. We often want to know what things influence development. We want to think, if people are exposed to X, will Y happen? And studying development is tricky because there are all these confounds. And we often believe that if one thing happens and then another thing happens, that the first thing caused the second thing. If there's a true causal relationship, if X truly causes Y, right? If exposure to alcohol actually causes brain damage, you should always see X first, right? There will be that temporality. X comes before Y if X causes Y. But that doesn't mean that in all cases, there's a causal relationship. So there's a lot of people that believe that vaccinations cause autism. Children get their vaccinations early in life. We start giving, vaccinations to babies, to toddlers, and people might notice the signs of autism when a child, even though, autistic people are autistic from birth, you don't really notice the delays until they're, maybe 3 or 5. And so there are parents who think, well, it must have been the vaccination because that happened. It happened first. It happened before the onset of the autism, the apparent onset of the autism. And so it caused. That's called the post hoc fallacy. So just because one thing comes before another doesn't mean that the first thing caused the second. It's also complicated to study developmental psychology because of the way that biology and experience interact. So we have a biologically determined temperament. Some of you are anxious today and you were anxious as babies. Some of you are disagreeable today and you were cranky babies. And some of you are easygoing and chill today, and you were easy babies. So we're born with that temperament, but then experiences can change our personality, how we behave from situation to situation. But we also have our own agency. You have agency to choose your friends. You have some agency to decide like where you work and what you want to do, to choose your environments. So let's say I remember my parents were really, really troubled about my brother hanging out with a group of weird kids. You know, one of them was schizophrenic, the other one was kind of delinquent, and another one, she had trichotillomania and picked her hair out. And my parents were like, no, they thought that group would just totally corrupt my brother, and they were so concerned about it that they actually pulled him out of high school without graduating. Pulled him out in grade 11 and put him in university as a non-degree status student, away from these people that was his friends. That was his first like real friend group. And you know, maybe he picked the weird kid group because he was a weird kid too, right? He's autistic. Maybe that's why he assorted with that group. And maybe his autistic behavior that troubled my parents, well, was it due to that group? Or did he choose to be in that group because he had certain issues? So these things complicate our understanding of what causes what. There are a couple of major research designs used in developmental psychology, the cross-sectional design and the longitudinal design. And there's other variants of this. These are the two basic ones. So let's say that I want to study how the stability of IQ scores. So you have an IQ of score of 5. Is that going to be stable at 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 90? The easiest way for me to do that is through a cross-sectional design. And I have a little picture here of the cross-sectional design. At one time point, let me turn on my laser pointer. At one time point, right now, I'm going to select a group of people from my study, and I want to have some 10-year-olds and some 30-year-olds and some 80-year-olds in my study. And let's say I measure their IQ scores. And I find that the 30-year-olds have the highest IQ. Can I conclude from that IQ decreases with age because there was a lower score in the group of 80-year-olds, in the older adults? Can you think of anything that could confound that study? I've measured IQ in 3 different groups: young, middle-aged, and old. And the oldest people have the lowest IQs. Does IQ drop as we get older because of some developmental decline? You know, it gets harder to remember things, it gets harder to process information. Can I conclude that drop is due to the effect of age, due to a developmental kind of effect? Yeah, so Mira says you can't conclude that because the older people may be influenced by different factors. Let's say they're all in the same environment right now. Right now, everybody has access to the internet, and right now, everyone has good food. Yeah, so yes, and Liam would be measuring IQ in the same way in this experiment. Otherwise, that would be a huge confound. So we're going to use a comparable IQ test. And good point, Liam, that IQ is tested a bit differently in children. So maybe I do it with 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and 80-year-olds. It seems to decline from like 20 to 40 to 60 to 80. It's going down. And can I conclude that it's because of the way aging affects, let's say, the brain? Well, the problem with a cross-sectional design is that people from these different cohorts, people in the 20-year-old cohort, people in the 40-year-old cohort, people in the 60-year-old cohort, and people in the 80-year-old cohort had different early life experiences. Maybe the reason that the IQ score is lower in the 80-year-old group is because they grew up with poorer access to nutrition. And maybe they grew up getting more kind of childhood diseases that could influence their development of their IQ that are now curable. You know, we don't deal with certain easily communicable diseases that people used to struggle with years ago. Back in the day, the flu was terrible and killed lots of people. And maybe that left lasting effects. Maybe they grew up in larger families, got less attention. Maybe they stayed in school for shorter periods of time. Maybe it's that. So Joshua suggests something different. Well, wouldn't it be better to measure the same people over a period of years to draw that conclusion? Yeah, and Liam makes a good point there. Like, there were a lot more pollutants back in the day, right? People used to have lead pipes in their houses. It used to be, lead in paint, and now we've gotten rid of a lot of that stuff. So Joshua was saying, well, what if we measured the same people over several years? And that would be great, that longitudinal study. So what if we recruited a sample who were all the same age? They're all 20. And then 20 years later, we measure their IQ again when they're 40. And in another 20 years, we measure their IQ when they're 60. And I think I would feel a bit more confident there if I saw that drop in IQ happening in the longitudinal research as well. Can you think of any reasons that this kind of study might be difficult to do or impracticable or confounded even? Yeah, Myra says it would have to be over a really long period of time. Where are you going to get the money to run a 40-year-long study? There are some studies like that. There are studies out there that follow a cohort of people for a really long time. There's a famous study on happiness. Terman studied intellectually gifted children over their lifetimes. But then you're like a researcher that's dedicated to this one sample, and you really have to track people down because they might otherwise just leave the study. So there's a big problem with when people drop out of the study. I don't care. I don't want to fill in this questionnaire. I'm not getting any credit points for it for an intro psych class anymore. So, I'm not answering your survey. And you can't replace them with other people because it's a within subject comparison. You're measuring the same person over and over. And they drop out, they're just gone. So you might end up with a really small sample at the end of the day, and that could be biased for its own reason. Maybe the most troubled people drop out. Maybe the people with low SES drop out. There's no one study design that's perfect. Right? When we're studying different types of research design in, I think it was chapter 1, we know that experiments have the highest internal validity, and experiments are the only way you can establish causation. So should we do an experiment on everything? Like the effects of language deprivation on children's development? No, we should not do that experiment. And that's why we use case studies, because it would be so unethical. So we have all these different types of studies available to us, and the best thing we can do when we're trying to understand understand something is actually look at the studies that are out there. There's a lot more of those cross-sectional studies out there because those are the easiest samples to recruit. You have one sample, you analyze it, and you can write up your data. You don't have to take 20 years to do it. So there's going to be fewer of these more expensive longitudinal studies. But if I saw both a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study showing a decrease in IQ in the later years, I'd be more convinced that this is some kind of a developmental biological effect, like maybe, as one of you guys were suggested, that dementia starts setting in. And like what Joshua says, it'd be really expensive to study people over a 20, 40-year period because you have to hire your research assistants for that period. You'd probably do more than one study, and you have a research center and you have salaried research staff that you're maybe hiring on a permanent basis instead of hiring a research assistant for a few weeks. So psychology has traditionally, thanks to Freud, overestimated the influence of early childhood experiences on later life development. I don't know how much experience you guys have with seeing psychologists or psychiatrists. I have a lot. And there are some therapists who are fixated on your early experiences. And any kind of trouble in your life, they're going to try to trace back to some kind of conflict that you had with your mother when you were 2. Those early experiences do have some effect on us. There is evidence that childhood attachment predicts your ability to be in committed relationships later on in your life. It has some effect on your sense of behavior. There's evidence that children who are raised in severely deprived environments absolutely do have poor outcomes. But children are overall a lot less fragile than we think. And they tend to bounce back, and they tend to be quite resilient. And so you can have people who've had troubled childhoods who go on to be functional adults. That's not to say, though, that people don't carry childhood trauma. I think that's can be particularly the case with, let's say, people who were sexually abused as children. So yeah, attachment issues can last, but by and large, children tend to thrive in spite of a wide range of environments, even considerable negative experience. One of the big questions in philosophy, and as you should know, psychology developed out of the discipline of philosophy. One of the big questions was is it nature or is it nurture? Are we hardwired for everything? Or are we born like a blank slate and then experience and learning writes on it? So it's a big classic philosophical debate. And in psychology, it's often a false dichotomy to think that way. Usually it's both. And what typically happens is that your genetics creates this kind of a window, like there's a range, and your score on some variable could fall anywhere in that range. And then nurture, education, nutrition, experience, all those things will determine where you fall, but it'll be within that range. So let's say that you are born with chromosomal trisomy who have Down syndrome. Well, that range is going to be a lot narrower than it is for people who don't have Down syndrome. You could end up having a really low IQ, or you could get excellent support in education and nutrition and end up with maybe an IQ of like 80. And that's a lot better than you'd have if you had a deprived environment, but you're not going to be a rocket scientist. You're not going to see, we wouldn't expect to see an IQ of like 110 or 120. There actually was I saw a post on LinkedIn about somebody with Down syndrome who graduated from university. When that happens, they're typically chimera cases. They're people whose the cells in their body might have genes from 2 different individuals. And so they're not like a mosaic case of Down syndrome. It's not the classic kind of Down syndrome. So they have like some cells that don't have it. So what typically happens is that nature and nurture interact. And they interact in different ways. Some environments can turn on genes that wouldn't be turned on otherwise. Right? Just because you have a gene doesn't mean that it's expressed. Your phenotype is what's expressed. But the environment can affect what gets turned on and off in your genotype. And then that comes through in your phenotype. So exposure to alcohol, I believe, turns on certain genes or turns off ones that should be on. And then that's expressed in fetal alcohol syndrome. And then, as I mentioned before, you have agency. So let's say you're born with your temperament, you're born with whatever your issues are, and then you go out and seek environments where you fit in, or that make you happy, or that corresponds with your interests. And then those environments act on you because of the way people respond to you. And, you know, in my brother's case, maybe he picked these weird kids, and my parents were terrified that they were going to make him be even weirder. I feel sorry for him. I wish he had his friends. So we're developing for about the first 25 years of your life. You guys are mostly what, 18 years old? You're not fully baked yet. Your brain is going to keep developing until you are 25. The bones in your face will finish maturing when you're about 25. That's when you're like done, and you'll be at the peak of your abilities, intellectually, physically, sexually, and then it's downhill from there in a lot of ways. You do the majority of your development. You do an amazing amount of development in utero. You are born as a baby with all your organs fully developed, and then they just keep growing from there. So your heart gets larger and larger, but it's not like growing new structures as it did when you were in utero. Your brain does continue developing. The frontal lobes keep developing. If you ever feel kind of bad about yourself, you can remind yourself that you're the sperm that won the race. And it's like 10 million others. But actually, recent research suggests that it isn't like the fastest, strongest sperm that necessarily gets there first. There's a lot of other things that can take a sperm out along its journey. And the egg apparently has some ability to be choosy and pick among some available alternatives. It describes the very early stages in the development, in human development in utero. In the earliest stages, like kind of blastocyst ball of cells period, women don't know they're pregnant. And so they might still be stressing themselves out and smoking and drinking and inhaling, I don't know, paint fumes, whatever. They don't know. At this stage, there are a lot of spontaneous abortions. That's because sometimes the genotype of the sperm and the egg that come together just don't work. It's not viable. And then, so a woman could get pregnant and then lose it without even knowing. Around the 9th week, you get an embryo. There's a lot of differentiation. Coming over my tongue today. So you start with like the kind of ball of cells, and then those cells start to differentiate and turn into different. And at one point, there's kind of like an inner tube and a middle tube and an outer tube. And the top of the tube starts developing into the brain and the nervous system. And that differentiation keeps increasing. So, we start over that period, right, from the 2nd to the 8th week, that embryonic period, you start seeing the development of limbs. They start as little nubs, and then they grow arms. Right? Facial features start to develop. Right? You start forming the major organs of the body. And in the fetal stage, this is where people start to feel like iffier about terminating pregnancies. All the major organs are established, and there's a detectable heartbeat. And then basically from there on, we're bulking up those organs that have developed. We're bulking up the body. Whereas before that, it's about the formation and differentiation of organs. There's a lot of brain development between day 18. To start off as like a neural, oh geez, this laser pointer moves more slowly than my fingers, so got a lag. You start off with this kind of neural tube situation. You see there's a lot of development by the time the baby's born, but it's not done developing when you're born. Consider how totally helpless a newborn infant. It can see well and it can smell well, but it can't survive on its own, can it? It's not like a baby horse that knows how to eat and can walk as soon as it's born. Human babies are born well before what might be an ideal time for brain development. But one of the biologically limiting factors that makes us be born with such an underdeveloped brain is the size of the head. There's a point at which if the head got any larger, a woman couldn't give birth safely. And in fact, human females have so much more trouble with giving birth than other animals do. It's a lot faster, it's a lot cleaner, it's a lot less painful and yowly for cats or dogs than for humans. And now we have excellent maternal care, and you're not likely to die in childbirth. But before that was the case, I don't know, maybe a couple of 100 years ago, you had about a 1/3 chance of dying in childbirth in your life if you were female. That's really high. So women dying in childbirth was very normal and very typical at one period. Some of that has to do with this really large size of the baby's head. There are environmental factors that can exert major influences on development. Consider the influence of hormones. We know that much to do with gender and sexual orientation seems to have to do with hormones that the developing brain is exposed to in utero. It is their testosterone there that's influencing brain development in a more male direction, for instance. And then there are pollutants, there are contaminants, bad things called teratogens that can have a negative impact on prenatal development. So I think you've all heard that pregnant women shouldn't drink and they shouldn't smoke. It can also harm the baby if they get flu or they get chickenpox. And then some babies are born who have genetic differences. There's genetic variation in humans, and sometimes that genetic variation leads to something amazing, and you have somebody who's really, really gifted, and it's very adaptive, whatever this difference was. And sometimes the difference is just unviable, and the body spontaneously aborts the offspring. And sometimes people there's viability, but maybe the random genetic difference doesn't seem very adaptive, and so people are born with genetic disorders. That's not an environment thing, that's a genetic thing. Babies can be born premature. Outcomes for premature babies are, the best they've ever been. Like, a lot of technology, there's a lot of medical science, intensive care that goes into supporting premature infants, and that's defined as being born prior to 36 weeks. and it can result in numerous problems. Generally, the less time in utero, the more premature, the greater the chances of having complications. Anyone here who are preemies? Saw an interesting comment. So Liam was born a month early. Okay, that's pretty significant. Ashian as well. Oh, we have an identical twin. That's cool. So full term for a twin, I guess twins would have to be born a little earlier because you're running out of room, right? Sandra was 3 weeks. So there's a few of you that were preemies and you're all doing well. Liam had an interesting comment about the sperm that won the race, that saying, and that we say that you were the sperm, which is interesting because you're just as much the egg as the sperm. And in fact, like your sense of self, of having your sense of being me doesn't develop until, early childhood. Your self-concept. Nicholas says a twin and I were born a week early. A week wouldn't be premature. So I think normal gestation is 39 weeks, and it's before 36 weeks that we would call premature. So you could be kind of a week ahead schedule, and that's okay. My daughter was induced because of diabetes. Wish I didn't do that though. So when infants are born, they show certain behaviors. We can study those behaviors. For instance, we can see where they look. You can move their eyes around. Do they look at mom more? Seems they like to look at face-like stimuli more compared to non-face stimuli. So infants like faces. They're born ready to feed. They're good at rooting out boobs. They can suck. You don't have to teach them to do that. They have certain basic reflexes, like if you put your finger in their hand, they'll grab onto it and hold. And that's some kind of evolutionary holdover when they're like hanging onto mom's fur. Hair, maybe? I don't know. And as the child gets more and more control, you see more intentional and more coordinated motor behavior. And a motor behavior refers to a motion that isn't like random flailing. It isn't a reflex. It's self-initiated force, right? The baby meant to do that. It's voluntary. And the voluntary use of your skeletal muscles is controlled by the somatic nervous system, whereas the control of muscles that you don't intentionally move, like your heart, you're not making it beat. It's just doing that. That's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And children sort of start by, well, they get more and more skilled. There's a point at which they kind of reach towards things and knock them over, and then there's a point at which they can use their fingers well enough to grab things. They have sensitive lips, and they like putting things in their mouth to explore them. There is a very cute stage where they chomp on their fists and their feet. And all babies go through the same kind of stages. There's a point at which they can't lift their head, and then they learn to do that. There's a point at which they're able to sit up without falling over. And then they crawl and they walk. I've heard that some kids skip the crawling stage, or could be extremely short. And then they can, first they can stand before they can walk, and then they walk before they run. That's cross-cultural. However, in different cultures, there are differences in parenting practices that can speed this up or slow it down. So in some cultures, they really swaddle the baby so they don't move, and they reach these a little later. And then in some cultures like ours, we want to see them hit these milestones as early as possible, so they're sticking them in jolly jump. But at the end of the day, adults from all these different cultures are equally motor skilled. As the body develops, the proportions change. So infants have very big heads. And as the rest of the body grows, the head is smaller relatively. It's a smaller proportion of the whole body. And then, first there's a lot of abdomen and not very much leg. And those legs get longer and longer as we mature. There are a lot of weird looking pictures of babies, especially the baby Jesus from the Middle Ages, because painters didn't figure this out, I guess. And so a lot of babies were drawn with adult dimensions, like having necks, for instance. Babies don't have necks. So that's why those medieval pictures look a little bit odd. Another major milestone in development is adolescence, which is where many of you are now. And adolescence is interesting. It's a transition between childhood and adulthood. And adulthood, gee, what does that mean? What does it mean to be an adult? That's the question. Are you guys adults? Can I say that I teach adults? Am I an adult teacher? Is this adult education? Okay, so adulthood has some biological reality. There's some idea, as Mira says, that the adult is kind of fully developed, whatever that means. Maybe you've grown to your full height. And then it's also socially constructed, because the social adult is somebody that's ready to take on their responsibilities in the world and has the basic skills to do stuff. And what age is fully adult? There's something a little bit arbitrary about that. Is it 16? Is it 18? Well, I think it's 16 for driving. It's 19 for drinking, at least in Nova Scotia. I'm not sure about New Brunswick. In the United States, it's 21 for drinking. There are cultures where people assume their adult roles as early teenagers. But here in our complex, advanced industrial society, we would never say that, a 14-year-old is adult. And so some of these social decisions become legal decisions. And sometimes you can fall between the cracks if you are in some kind of a children's program, maybe outpatient program, and then, they say you're an adult and they're not going to see you anymore, but you can't get into the adult program at least 18. So you see there's some subjectivity. Biologically, you're adult when you're basically done maturing and you are capable of having your own offspring. But even that is not a perfect definition, because there are situations called precocious puberty where a child might go through puberty, start menstruating at age 3 and have a child at age 5. The youngest mother is aged 5. And there's quite a few cases of that globally, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds having babies. And in those cases, it's often, sadly, like the father is often a member of the family. There, I had funny comment about baby Jesus looking super jacked. Usually did see a picture like that, but I didn't include it. But yeah, I mean, look at those abs, right? I don't know if that's baby Jesus. So during adolescence, you have your primary sexual characteristics, like the sort of like the penis and the vagina, the uterus, those things that are directly involved in reproduction, that become mature and ready for reproduction. You were born with those; they were immature, and now they've matured and they're ready to go. And then we have, so I don't like the term emergence there. That sounds wrong. It's not like you're born like a Barbie doll and then, oh wow, you turned 12 and now you have a vagina. No, I think emergence is right. It's more about the maturation. However, you do truly see the emergence of secondary sex characteristics. And those are associated with biological sex, but they are not directly used in reproduction. You could have a baby and not have breasts, and the baby could survive if somebody else breastfed it or gave it a bottle. And so those involve things like breasts, things like the kind of hourglass shape that you see in females. It involves, the underarm hair and the underarm smell, and what else? The Adam's apple and the lower vocal register for males, like beards, pubic hair. I don't see that on children. The big milestones are menarche, when females start menstruating, and spermarche, when males have their first ejaculation, often like a wet dream. And boys tend to reach spermarche about a year after girls reach menarche. And puberty seems to hit a bit earlier in industrialized countries where we all have really good nutrition, but in countries where there is poor nutrition, much higher levels of stress, this can get slowed down, such that maybe you'd see girls hitting puberty at maybe much later, maybe 17, 18. So, as I've mentioned before, you kind of reach your peak in your sort of early to mid 20s. That's when you're at your peak physically, sexually, in terms of cognitive processing, physical flexibility. And then after that, it goes downhill. It starts to decline. Your memory declines. Your reaction time declines. There are some cognitive abilities that increase with age. Wisdom would be one of them. Crystallized intelligence increases over time because you keep learning new facts and you store them up in your long-term memory. That age-related decline starts really slowly. So it's hard to see it in a 28-year-old. And the difference between 25 and 28 would be really hard to see. But it gets faster and faster. And so the difference between 35 and 38 is more. The difference between 45 and 48 is even more apparent. The difference between 95 and 98 would be very apparent. So that decline kind of picks up in speed. As people get older, they become less fertile. There's more likely to be birth complications or genetic defects if they do get pregnant. And for women, men stay fertile for pretty much their whole lives, even though they produce, say, less sperm and it's not as good quality, etc. But they can still have children in their 80s. As you know, fertility declines sharply in the 30s and 40s, like precipitously. And women hit menopause typically in the late 40s. And That is an important biological clock to consider. When I was your age, there was a great hostility to teen pregnancy. That was like the end of your life, and the worst thing could happen to you. It's like crisis, terrible. And the idea was, no, you got to get your education, go to undergrad, go to grad school, get your job, get the house and the car so that you're in a nice neighborhood for the kids to go to school in, and so that you can afford all these things because babies need all this stuff and it's tremendously expensive and blah, 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 all these reasons to delay. And so a lot of us followed that kind of that career path. And then, we're kind of hitting our 35 and, thinking, oh shit, because your body doesn't wait. And then, people start spending a lot of money on in vitro fertilization or jumping through the hoops to be foster parents or to adopt. And my TA last semester was an undergraduate student, so she was in like 4th year, and she had 4 kids. Like, she had the first one at 17. I thought, damn, like, I wish I did that. Seemed like a good idea. Because there's always time for school and work. If you want to have biological children, you probably can't do that at 40. But can you start a university degree at 40? Can you start a new job at 40? Absolutely. I think maybe the expectations was that for women to follow almost like a male path of you have to build lots of resources and credibility before you can go have a family. And that actually doesn't work as well for female people, given our biological constraints. I think that this is a good place to stop. So on Friday, we'll pick up with theories of cognitive development. And I will stop the recording here and take any of your questions about the exam.